One of the things I like about lashing on as a technique to attach the work to the cloth beam is that it uses as little warp as possible. If you tie your warp on, it typically takes about 6 inches, sometimes a little bit more. And that's great if you're weaving a scarf or doing something where you want to use you want that extra length on the warp. But if I'm weaving a sample or anything else where I'm not using fringe, then I want to get as much mileage out of my warp as possible. So I want to show you how I lash on. I started from one side of the warp. You can start in the middle and work out to each side, but I thought this would be easier since I'm working closer to the camera and you might be able to see it more easily. I divide the warp into about 1-inch groups. It doesn't have to be exact. You don't have to measure that. You can just eyeball it, but you don't want your groups of warps any bigger than that because it makes it too difficult for the warp to spread out. So I'm just going to put pretty even tension on that group of warp ends, and then I'm going to tie an overhand knot. And the thing that's important, or one of the things that's important about tying the overhand knot, is making sure that you have all of your ends together. You want to make sure that when you pull that knot tight, you are going to capture all of those ends. So you check that first. Then if you grab a hold of that end, you can see where the overhand knot is. And if I let go of that, I can just gently move that down toward the end of the warp. I want to do that so that I end up with my warp groups with the knots pretty much in the same place. So again, I take just about 1 inch of warp, tie an overhand knot, tie an overhand knot, check to make sure that I'll have a hold of all of those ends, pull the knot down to the end, and continue to the end of the warp. If your warp doesn't divide evenly and you end up with fewer ends on the selvage side, that's actually a good thing, because having a little bit narrower group of ends there can put a little bit more tension on those warp threads, which is good for the selvage. So I'm just tying those overhand knots, working them down toward the end of that group of warp threads. Here I have my floating selvage through the reed, but I've just got that pushed off to the side. You can tie your floating selvage into the warp bundle if you want to, but I like to tie mine separately to the rod when I'm finished lashing on. So here you see I have a little bit narrower group of warp threads. That's okay. They don't have to all be exactly the same. So now what I want to do is count the number of warp groups that I have across here. I have a 21-inch wide warp and about 20 groups of warp threads. I want to position my rod here so that I have room between that and the cloth beam for my hands to do what they need to do, but not so that the warp is going to be too close. If this knot ends up sitting down here on the rod, then I have no room for adjustment, and that can be a problem. I've counted my warp groups and I have about 20. I want to see how far they are from that rod, and I'm just going to estimate that this distance is about 2 inches. So I need to make sure that my lashing cord is long enough to go from the rod through that warp group and back to the rod. So if I call that 4 inches for each one, say I need 4 inches for each one, and 4 times 20 is 80, so a little over 2 yards. I'm going to call that 2.5 yards. And then I've already measured a lashing cord, and you can use a variety of things. Some people like to use Texol so they can reuse the cord. I use a doubled strand of rug warp, 8/4 rug warp or cotton warp. And I measured it 2.5 yards, and then I folded it in half. So I actually have 5 yards of thread that's folded in half. I'm going to start with the looped end, put it around or underneath the rod, and I'm going to pull that thread all the way through the loop. So that gives me a secure way to start it on the rod. And the way I know where to start it is because I want to position it so that when I put it through this work bundle, it's going to pull that out straight. The way that you can divide your work bundle is by stepping on one of your plain weave treadles, and you'll see that that warp just opens up there evenly. Then I'm going to reach through from the left side. I'm going to grab that warp or that lashing cord and pull it all the way through. The thing that's really important about this that will help you is to maintain even tension the whole time that you have a hold of the thread, the lashing thread or lashing cord in your right hand, and transfer that tension to your left hand. So again, I have it in my right hand. I'm going through that group of warp threads, over the rod and under, transferring again to my right hand. Going through that one, and you can see the tension is staying the same on all those groups. And as I go around the rod, you want to make sure that these cords don't get in your way. So keep an eye on the warp as it comes through the reed, and position that lashing cord over the rod so that it's pulling those straight out from the reed as much as possible. Over the reed, grab it with your left hand. I still have tension on it. Grab it with my right hand. It goes through the next bunch. Some people like to put the lashing cord on a small shuttle or tie it into a butterfly, but I've tried both of those things and they didn't work very well for me. It just seemed to make it more difficult to deal with. So 2.5 yards is not, for me, not so long that it's hard to pull through those groups of warp threads. I'm going to continue this all the way across the warp, keeping that tension on, going through from right to left, over the top and underneath, through from right to left. And as you do this, it will seem easier. If you haven't done it before, it may seem that there's a lot to think about and may feel pretty awkward to begin with, but after you do it a number of times, it will feel easier and you'll get the hang of keeping that tension even. Like anything else with weaving, things that feel strange at first will become second nature after you've done them a few thousand times, a few hundred times, or however many. But anyway, I like this technique for putting a warp on. It also works if you keep the tension on that cord. It works really well for evening out the tension of the warp from the time that it's first tied on. And I get over here to the far end of the warp, and I don't do anything special over here. I'm going to go over that rod again, and you can tie any kind of a knot that you want to over here. I tie what's called a half hitch, or I make a loop, and I just pull that through. I make another loop. I go down through that triangle that's created by the last threads and up through that loop again. I do that 3 times, and that seems to hold pretty well. Then I release the treadle, and if I feel this with my hands, the tension is already pretty even across the warp. I'm going to tension it up a little bit, test it, and if I find that one side's looser, in fact, a lot of times when you're first learning to do this, you'll find that the side where you started is a little bit loose, and you can use these cords. If I wanted to tighten this up, I would just pull on this and kind of walk that little bit of extra across the warp until it evened out, and keep touching that, feeling that with your hand, and you'll feel how even that is. Then what I'll do next is take my floating selvage and I just tie this onto the rod. As I said, you can tie that into that warp group if you want to, but it's not under the same kind of tension that the rest of the warp is. So I like to just put it on there separately. So that's it. So I hope you have, I hope you give that a try. You can see that you're not using very much warp. When I start weaving, my warp is going to spread at about that point. So I really only used about maybe 3 inches, maybe 3.5 at the most to spread that warp. And I think it's worth doing that. I'd rather dedicate my warp to woven cloth than knots tied on the loom. So give it a try.